Previously on Murder on Music Row.
Well, I mean, my career was basically over. You know, again, I feel like how the police have treated me and how they've done me, it put a cloud over me, put a cloud over my head, my career, and to me, it's just not fair.
They said that his songs were on there more and they were higher than they were after Kevin's murder.
Tony was instantly cut out of Chuck's operation, and I mean, instantly that day, it was, done.
What'd you think of Chuck Dixon?
He's a scammer. Like I say, by then I thought they all were pieces of,
You can say it.
I just thought they're prey, they're predators. They get these poor innocent kids coming in town, like I told you, and they take all their money and then send them on their way, and not a tear is shed. So I don't like any of them.
George Strait strums the opening of Murder on Music Row at the 2000 Academy of Country Music Awards at the Universal Amphitheater in Los Angeles. He's wearing a white cowboy hat and silver tie. He finishes the first verse and the crowd starts to realize what's happening. From stage left, here comes Alan Jackson. White hat, long black coat. On that night, in that setting, Strait and Jackson were looking right into the eyes of the music industry executives sitting in their close-up ready seats, and the two troubadours were poking fun at these gargoyled gatekeepers, accusing them of going soft and allowing pop music to infiltrate their business, murdering something everyone loved. 14 million people watched on national television. Larry Cordell wasn't there.
Something happened. I was on the road, couldn't go. We had invitations, of course, but we couldn't go. I mean, it was everybody in the world was like, they're playing your tune, here. And I'd heard rumors that they were going to, but I didn't know if it was true or not.
Let's cut to a year later at the Country Music Awards. That Spitfire performance by Strait and Jackson won the CMA for Country Event of the Year. Amazing, right? But I'll tell you what, if you think that song's story ended there, you haven't been paying attention.
Down on Music Row.
This is Murder on Music Row, an investigative podcast. I'm Keith Sharon. I work for the Tennessean in Nashville. On March 9th, 1989, a young man named Kevin Hughes was shot twice in the head in the middle of Music Row. In August of 2022, my editor handed me a flash drive full of police files, interrogation reports, coroner notes, crime scene photos and drawings, phone records, and internal memos between Nashville police, the FBI, and law enforcement officials in other states. Somewhere along the way, I began to feel like it was our responsibility to tell the story that two bullets stopped Kevin Hughes from telling. This is Episode 7, Life of Sin. A lot of people kind of like Chuck Dixon. His large and in-charge personality to some was endearing. Back in the day, Chuck's pomposity was on display. He had a promotional video. It said, "This is Chuck Dixon, the Cashbox Promoter of the Year, the last 10 years in a row." A lot of people kind of hated Tony D'Antonio. I interviewed more than a few people who said Tony D was a whack job wannabe honcho. Together, Chuck and Tony D were pals and shared business interests. Chuck was the alpha. Tony D was the also-ran. I feel like I need to put these two guys in context. If luminaries like Owen Bradley and Chet Atkins and power executives like Tony Brown were operating in the penthouses of the country music industry, Chuck Dixon and Tony D'Antonio were out by the skeevy and grungy curb. They trolled around Nashville looking for country music dreamers to scam. I asked Tony Brown, the former MCA president, about the infinite sadness of Nashville, about the people who came to town and got destroyed.
A lot of those people that you're talking about had a real talent. They just didn't have real connections. I mean, you've always heard the term, it's who you know. And that is true to this day. I mean, my connections I made through the years is what got me that job.
Chuck Dixon and Tony D'Antonio were the wrong connections. In all my reporting, this is what I've learned. This thing, the business side of Nashville, choosing, coaxing, and guiding artists, it's a difficult thing to do. Tony Brown and I talked about just how hard it is. Remember, Tony Brown won 4 Academy of Country Music Awards, including ACM's Producer of the Year. He remembers 2 great fuck-ups in his music business career.
Garth Brooks, I remember the first time me and Jimmy Bowen, when Garth was being shopped around town, Bob Dole, his manager, was bringing him around to every label to get him signed, and he brought Garth to me and Jimmy Bowen. And so Garth came to Jimmy Bowen's house. And I'll tell this story. I've never told it in a microphone ever. I've only told it at private parties. But we're sitting in Bowen's house, and Garth walks in with that hat, and he takes it off, and he sits down with those big eyes. And Jimmy Bowen said, "Well, Garth, who is Garth Brooks?" And Garth said, "Well, Bowen, I'm a little James Taylor. I'm a little George Strait. I'm a little Queen. I'm a little Bob Seger. And I'm a lot of Garth Brooks." And he got up to leave, and Bowen said, "So what do you think about him?" I said, "I think he's full of shit." And he said, "Me too." Flash forward 2 months later, that special from the Cowboy Stadium where he comes flying through the air on that rope on fire. I called Bowen and said, "Hey, Bowen, he was telling us the truth."
He didn't believe in Garth Brooks, and he didn't believe in Dwight Yoakam.
People say, is there anybody you missed on? Garth Brooks is one. Another one is Sherman Halsey brought me Dwight Yoakam, and I didn't want to sign him because he sang through his nose. Sherman said, "You're making a mistake. This guy is packing them in. Girls love him. Clubs are just standing room only, every state. You're making a mistake." And I did.
Chuck and Tony operated in a town in the late 80s and early 90s that was too glitzy to even acknowledge their existence. In Nashville in the 80s and 90s, predators and opportunists were waiting to take advantage of naive people who came to town. A slew of independent promoters, including Chuck Dixon and Tony D, fed on that naivete. If Chuck Dixon was on the fringe of the music scene, Tony D was a piece of lint on the fringe of the music scene. He was kind of a pathetic figure. Tony D was a California guy. He graduated from Franklin High School in Los Angeles in 1963. He graduated from LA Trade Tech in 1967 after studying electronics. While he was going to trade school, he tried to make it as a singer. He recorded a couple of songs at Terran Studios in Hollywood. Looking for a career that would go somewhere, he chose the railroad industry. He worked as an electrician's apprentice for the Southern Pacific Railroad. But Tony D got injured on the job. He and his $10,000 injury settlement moved to Oregon, and he began studying music at Lane College. In the early 1970s, he was like the kids he would later scam. Tony D knew a guy who knew a guy. He came to Nashville to write songs. He worked at a gas station, drove an ice cream truck, got a woman pregnant, got married, became a father, and got divorced. I'm not sure the order of any of those events. He, his wife, and child moved back and forth from Nashville to Las Vegas. He was a card dealer and a pit boss in Vegas. There were even more stories about him either hitting on or offending just about every woman he met. When his first wife divorced him in 1985, he was an unemployed record promoter. Tony D was living in a small house off Gallatin Road. He got a weird idea, because that's what Tony D does. He needed money, so he decided to sell his house. He made up flyers, hung them around Nashville. 4-bedroom house, $100. Well, of course, the flyer wasn't true. If you paid Tony D $100, your name would be put in a raffle for the house. He collected $300 before the DA cracked down on him. Apparently, it was illegal to run a lottery in Tennessee unless you're a charitable institution. Tony D was in need of charity. You get the picture. One day, Tony D was playing pinball in the lobby of the United Artists building on Music Row. The building had been built by two of Elvis Presley's backup singers in 1974. It offered a 360-degree view of Nashville. In November of 1985, Tom McEntee was the editor at Cashbox magazine. He struck up a conversation with Tony D over the pinball machine and was impressed with his card-dealing background. He must be good with numbers. So McEntee hired Tony D to work in the editorial research department. It wasn't long before he became chart director. Suddenly, Tony D had a position of power and stature in the music business. There were people around town who thought he had a drug problem.
He showed all the symptoms of somebody that was strung out on stimulants, probably cocaine, I thought at the time. I thought he was a loose cannon, and I thought he was nuts. I thought he was just a dangerous person to be around when I was around him, because he couldn't sit still. He couldn't stand still. He talked a mile a minute, and he was very mysterious. I didn't interact with Tony much, but the times I did, he made me nervous. I didn't like him at all.
That was Mark Carman, who was a singer and then took over as director of operations for Cashbox magazine. Here's Bill Wentz, who was a music promoter. He remembers a meeting with Tony D.
I'd been to lunch with Tony D'Antonio. I mean, I just had a terrible feeling about him. I met him there with the artist, Bobby Lace. He kept leaving the table to run to the restroom, and we sort of figured out, Bobby Lace and I did later on, that he was doing cocaine.
No matter his problems, Tony always seemed to be lurking in the shadows of Chuck Dixon.
They were a team. They were very, very close. Thought they were hooked at the, hinged at the hip.
Music promoter Jerry Duncan went to lunch with Tony D at the Sailmaker restaurant. During the lunch, Jerry noticed Tony D had a visitor.
I never was a big fan. He was kind of a thug, kind of a person. When he first got to be the chart editor, I asked him if I could take him to lunch, get to know him a little better. So we did. We went to a restaurant, and when we went in, Chuck Dixon showed up shortly afterwards and sat across the way and watched us the whole time. That told me something right away, that something wasn't exactly right. My impression of Tony was never particularly good.
By early 1986, Tony D was the chart director. He was Kevin Hughes's boss. And Chuck and Tony D were running what most people considered a dirty chart.
When Tony D was doing the chart there for a while, and it started getting more corrupt. What happened to me is that it became common knowledge among the Cashbox promoters that something was going on. I can give you my personal experience. I had some of my clients, when Tony was doing the chart, it was the chart editor, I had clients to tell me that he had recommended that they hire Chuck Dixon. And so the chart editor should not, he was apparently getting a kickback from Chuck.
Even with Chuck's backing, Tony D had problems in the office. I've been told he had bags of marijuana in and around his desk. Sometimes he smoked in the office. Other times he tried to sell drugs to coworkers and clients. And the women complained that he was a relentless harasser. His office decorum got him fired. On March 26, 1988, Richard F. D'Antonio's name was no longer listed in the Cashbox staff box. Tony D became a music promoter working in tandem with Chuck Dixon.
But when Tony got fired, quit, whatever situation was, he became Chuck's do-it guy, his gopher guy, go make it happen guy.
He was Chuck Dixon's right-hand man. When Amy Lavelle and her husband, Dave Mikulski, needed a place to stay, remember, Amy worked as an assistant in the Cashbox office and Dave was a singer. Tony D said they could rent his house. On the day Amy and Dave moved in, as Tony D was moving out, they noticed a hole had been dug in the backyard. To Dave's horror, he looked in the hole. There were 11 dead puppies. Tony D told Dave he had nothing to do with the deaths of the puppies.
We had a situation where he had a dog, and she had 11 puppies. And the first experience I ran into with Tony was that there was a rainstorm, and they all drowned in a pit that the mother had made. So I really got upset about that because I love dogs, and he didn't pay any attention to it at all.
Tony D had left the bodies there, so Dave buried each one in its own grave. The incident bothered Dave and Amy so much, they later told the police. In May of 1986, Tony D married a woman named Carolyn Cox. I was never able to get in touch with her. I found court files in which she reported Tony D made $13,000 per year working at Cashbox. Then, when he started working with Chuck Dixon, the real money started to flow in. Carolyn said Tony D was suddenly able to buy 2 houses, 3 cars, a grand piano, and a motorcycle, all during the time he worked at Cashbox. In the early morning hours of March 10, 1989, just more than 4 hours after Kevin Hughes had been killed, Carolyn Cox answered the phone in the bedroom she shared with Tony D. It was 3 a.m. The caller was Chuck Dixon. Chuck asked for Tony D. Carolyn explained he wasn't home. She asked what the call was about. Chuck told her, business. As she hung up, Tony D appeared in the doorway, surprising her. She asked him where he'd been, and he said, Chattanooga. He was telling the truth, at least partially. I'll get into those details later in this podcast. 19 days after Kevin Hughes was gunned down on Music Row, Tony D was interviewed by Detective Pat Postiglione. Tony D said he liked Kevin, and he taught him how to do record charting. When Postiglione asked him why people said he and Kevin didn't get along, Tony D said this about himself: I'm pushy, and people tend to dislike me. He said he was currently working as a promoter, but he'd been discussing coming back to Cashbox. Sometime after that interview, Tony D told people he was going to Mexico to get treatment for a blood disorder. In the next 2 months, his wife would file for divorce. Their marriage was officially over in July of 1989. Remember the guy, Mickey Jones, who was on the charts with The Gal from San Antone before his record was even pressed? Tony D and Chuck Dixon promoted Mickey's next record, called A Song a Day. There's a congratulatory advertisement in Cashbox with their names in August of 1989. There's another advertisement mentioning Tony D's name in October of 1989. After that, his name dropped out of the magazine forever. Tony D's trail went dry for more than 2 years. He turned up again on November 22nd, 1991, in Chatsworth, Georgia. Apparently, Tony D believed someone in a house on Colonial Hills Drive owed him money.
He came in through the back door. I had never seen him before in my life.
That's the Tennessean's Jordan Washington reading the words of Charles Scott, who was being interviewed by investigators from the Murray County Sheriff's Department. Charles Scott was the owner of the house and the ower of money to Tony D. Scott gave a detailed description of the incident for the Murray County Sheriff's Department in Georgia. Here, he's quoting Tony D.
He said, I'll kill everybody. Made everybody come into the den and sit on the couch.
Tony D took Charles and his wife Frida into the kitchen. He held a gun to Charles's head and asked Frida if she believed he would blow Charles's head off.
He said he would gouge her eyes out and kill everybody.
In the living room, one of the hostages was able to reach a phone. They called police. As officers approached the front door, Tony D ran out the back. He attempted to hop over a fence, but he couldn't. While taking his second run at the fence, an officer caught him. The police report said the officer's flashlight inadvertently hit Tony D in the side of the face. Richard D'Antonio was arrested at about 8:15 p.m. on November 22, 1991. He eventually pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and burglary. The police report said he was 45 years old, 6'1", 240 pounds. He told them his occupation was entertainer. His personal belongings included a pocket knife, a Wittenauer wristwatch, a gold nugget bracelet, a gold ring, a gold chain, and a diamond piano pendant. He also had $882 in cash. Sounds like Tony D. Here's the problem with Tony D's arrest. Up in Nashville, where Bill Pridemore was investigating a murder, the information about Tony D didn't land on Pridemore's radar until about 10 years later. The gun Tony D used in Georgia was either never found at the crime scene or was lost by the Murray County Sheriff's Department before it could be tested. Tony D accepted a plea bargain that didn't deter him from his next criminal activity, which had a connection to a little house in Georgia.
It's a white one-story house built mid-century, 40s or 50s, I would say. One level. It's up on this really beautiful rolling hill overlooking like a field and Lookout Mountain. Like it's in a really picturesque spot, and there's big trees around it, big front porch. It was a very, very lovely house to move to, and it was a house of stability.
That's Hillary Libby talking about her childhood home in Flintstone, Georgia. The town did not get its name from the 1960s cartoon. The cars down there do not have wheels made out of rock. You cannot stop your car with your bare feet. Those are Flintstone cartoon references for those among you who are uninitiated. There are actually Flintstone deposits in the earth in Flintstone, but that didn't matter.
It's always bedrock, and yeah, we always get those kind of jokes.
That's Hillary's younger sister, Erica. In the summer of 2022, I came to work one day and I was determined to find a woman named Patricia Smith who owned the house on North Georgia's Highway 341, where one of the biggest drug busts in the history of the South took place. I looked on Facebook and found the obituary of Patricia Smith of Flintstone, Georgia. It named her daughter among the surviving relatives, so I got in touch with the daughter. However, she said her mother didn't own that house on Highway 341, but she said she knew a girl from high school who she thought lived near that house. Well, as it turns out, that girl from high school had lived in the house with the drug bust, and she also had a mother named Patricia Smith. There were two Patricia Smiths in Flintstone who didn't know each other. Sometimes you just get lucky. So anyway, I interviewed Erica and Hillary Libby, two sisters who lived in the White House on Highway 341. Patricia Smith and her daughters moved into the house in 1992. They rented from a guy named Steve Daniel.
I mean, definitely a receding hairline. I mean, he was just like a middle-aged guy. He had a very jolly face. He was a pretty jolly, happy person. You know, when he was around, it was always pleasant. He was always like a very nice guy.
The house was more than a bit mysterious to two elementary school-aged girls in 1992.
There were bullet holes in the dining room window that was just replaced like 2.5 years ago. So, and that's on the front end of the house. I don't know, you might dig into that. There might be some more history that you don't know about. When we moved into it, it had been empty for a long time.
I dug into the records of that house. Here's what I found. The FBI had known about that house for a long time. Their surveillance of that house was part of Operation Sand Mountain Gloom. I found several reports that originated in the Huntsville office of the FBI. Operation Sand Mountain Gloom was conducted by the Lookout Mountain Task Force with cooperation of the Alabama FBI and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Erica said she will never forget one day in particular.
So that would be September 22nd of 1992.
What happened then?
The largest drug bust in Walker County occurred at our house. The garage was locked, so we didn't have access to the garage. And the GBI came and again presented with a search warrant, and they kicked down the door to the garage and found 450 pounds of marijuana, give or take.
Operation Sand Mountain Gloom would eventually find about 3,000 pounds of marijuana in total at several places around the property. The FBI wasn't finished at the house on Highway 341. They made the house a base for surveillance.
And they set up cameras in your house, correct?
They did, yeah, in our laundry room. Yeah. So like it was a wild time. Yeah. So they did. I guess they set up like a sting in our laundry room. The laundry room had cameras like pointed out like toward that garage, toward the backyard, you know, where anybody that was coming up to the house would, you know, if anybody had been driving up, they would have been on those cameras. Yeah.
And their efforts led them to Steve Daniel, the landlord. A quick aside about Steve Daniel. He had once been a country music hopeful with twangy love songs that caught the eye of a promoter in Nashville. But when the big music money never came, he hopped on the marijuana train. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation would later say he wasn't cut out to be a drug kingpin. Steve Daniel was arrested along with 18 other people. They were running drugs for a Mexican cartel. Steve didn't want to go to prison for the rest of his life, so he decided to become an informant. He sang louder than a mockingbird. He turned over notes, phone recordings, and telephone records. Among the team of smugglers and drug dealers involved in the crime was a man he called D. In Nashville, they knew him as Tony D. Steve Daniel, like so many others, had got involved with the wrong music connection. But in his case, he became a drug smuggling buddy. Suddenly, a representative of Georgia law enforcement descended on Nashville.
A GBI agent, Del Thomason, contacted us and he wanted to meet us, so he came into town.
It was 1992, and Del Thomason was looking for information about Tony D.
And he had some mini cassettes. He said he had an informant.
That informant was Steve Daniel. As it turns out, Steve had seen the Crime Stoppers episode about the murder on Music Row, and he began talking to Tony D about drug running, eluding police, and the murder of Kevin Hughes. Those conversations were recorded, and those recordings, at the time Prideborn didn't know what was on the tapes, might be material the district attorney could use as direct evidence in a murder trial. Pridemore said he had known for a long time who pulled the trigger on 16th Avenue South.
We knew that Tony D'Antonio killed Kevin.
It seemed everybody in town knew. Tony D was the guy Bill Wentz called the morning after the murder. Remember, he left a voicemail message. "We know you did it, or something stupid." That message was for Tony D. Pridemore said without direct evidence, they couldn't arrest him. The problem was, Steve Daniel was busy. He was turning state's evidence against a whole drug ring connected to a Mexican cartel. Pridemore asked the GBI agent a question.
Can we get him wired, or can he come forward and talk to us? He said, we're using him, and once we've worn him out, we've used him all up, we'll get back with you.
Here's what happened. Everything in the Murder on Music Row investigation stopped. I mean, everything. The detectives had interviewed all the witnesses on their list. They believed Kevin was killed because he threatened the gravy train that benefited promoters like Chuck Dixon and others. Pridemore thought Sammy Sadler was involved, possibly as the guy who delivered Kevin to the killer, but he had no direct evidence, and he believed Tony D pulled the trigger. That's it. The whole thing. And it was 1992. 3.5 years after Kevin Hughes was gunned down in the street. What do you do if you believe you've solved the case, but you're unwilling to try to prosecute someone with only circumstantial evidence? It sounds like it's over. Like knowing who did it is somehow enough. This isn't, however, a TV show. Here's what happens when you wait. You allow a killer to walk free. Nashville shook on May 25th, 1991. On that date, Billboard magazine used a new system for ranking songs that didn't involve radio airplay. And the earthquake that happened can be described in one word: SoundScan. Oh my goodness, SoundScan. It was a computerized way of ranking the popularity of albums and songs based on actual sales. SoundScan took away the old honor system that was not honorable at all. Superstar artists like Garth Brooks and the class of 1989, Clint Black, Alan Jackson, Travis Tritt, and Mary J. Carpenter, showed crossover appeal, and SoundScan was their proof.
Up until then, country artists never got their true respect or due for the sales they had. Because if you recall, the charts at the time, even the album charts, were based on people from Billboard calling a record store. And they get some 19-year-old purple-haired girl on the phone and say, "What's your top 5 selling albums this week?" Well, it's never going to be a country album. But coincidentally, SoundScan starts about the same time that Clint Black and George Strait started coming through. And it showed what the real sales were of country. And that was a huge factor as well.
SoundScan proved literally that Garth Brooks was as popular or even more popular than Nirvana. In the early 1990s, Garth was doing stadium shows with fire and explosions, soaring around stadiums holding onto a rope. Hank Williams, the ultimate stand-still dude, must have been doing angry teeth grinding in his grave. With Friends in Low Places and The Dance, Garth Brooks was Jagger and Springsteen in pointy boots and a cowboy hat. In my opinion, Tony Arata wrote Garth's best song. I know, you might say Friends in Low Places, but The Dance is better.
It was never an act with him. I mean, that's literally, to me, he approaches it as he is. He feels like he was put here to do this, and he genuinely loves people, and he loves playing for people. It's not, I'm getting paid to do this. It's, this is what I do this for free. And I think the trappings were never the thing with him. I always admired the fact that when he hit, and he hit real fast, he had a lot of dates on the books with little bitty clubs everywhere and little bitty theaters, you know. I mean, they were road musicians trying to make a living. And he honored every one of them because it was more important to him to fulfill his commitment to those places. I mean, it's not an act. There's no, and if it was an act, somebody would have seen through it by now. It's not put on. It's not. He would rather be on stage playing than anything. And the other thing that I've always noticed, it hit me most, we saw him in Dallas. I could watch the place slowly fill up. And I think probably 26,000 people in there. And when he was on stage, honest to goodness, there wasn't a soul in there that did not think that Garth came to play for them. You know, he played for 80,000 people in Crow Park over in Dublin, and they're all thinking he's singing to them. I don't even know how you do that. It's not, I got to go be Garth. That's who he is.
There were 3 earthquakes in Nashville in the early and mid-1990s. SoundScan, Garth, and Shania. More specifically, Shania Twain and Mutt Lange.
I remember where I was. I was on West End, just about to cross the interstate into Music Row when I heard Shania's first single as a Mutt Lange artist. Then I knew that was like a brick wall of change.
That's Trey Bruce, who has won 16 ASCAP awards. That's the American Society for Composers, Authors, and Publishers. He's had 10 #1 hits. In the mid-1990s, Shania Twain was a regular country artist. She's Canadian like Anne Murray and Katie Lang. Nothing in Shania's background indicated how revolutionary she would become. In June of 1993, Shania met a guy named Robert John Lang. He said he was interested in producing her next album. Mutt Lange had produced Def Leppard and AC/DC. Shania and Mutt were married 6 months after they met. In 1995, they released their first collaboration, The Woman in Me. Here's what that recording did. It blew up Nashville sound. The song was originally called Gol Darn Gone and Done It, but that sounded so dumb. So Shania and Mutt changed its name to Love Gets Me Every Time.
When I heard the record, I couldn't identify what I was listening to. I immediately thought that the lyric was pandering nonsense, but the record was undeniable. No matter how gosh darn gone and done it the lyric was. I mean, we don't talk like that. That part was a big turnoff for me, but man, that record hit my ears like candy. You know, we never went back from that. That was, I mean, you know, that record sold tens of millions.
The Nashville sound was lilting strings and smooth choruses. The Shania Mutt Lange sound was as layered as a wedding cake, or even 10 wedding cakes on top of each other.
The huge music change came with Mutt. I mean, that Shania record, suddenly we had 5 kick drums mashed together to make one kick, where before you just put a pillow in the kick and mic it once and it barely makes a noise. I mean, the fiddle, when he stacked the fiddle part, which wasn't something we were used to, he didn't stack it with the same fiddle player. He called in 5 different fiddle players to play the same part to catch the essence of friction. I mean, you talk about a record we didn't see coming. That would be it. I mean, nobody thought of that.
And Mutt did that.
Right. Called in a different fiddle player to play we stack fiddle parts all the time now because of Mutt. But we don't call in a separate fiddle player to do each stack. And those are things that he did that were very unique, because one fiddle player, he may play with one of his fingers technically out of position, which makes the angle of his bow different than the guy who plays with his picture-perfect finger positions. I mean, that's what he was betting on to make his record stand out. And although we couldn't put our finger on it, it stood out. That record sounded so different, we didn't even know where to start opening the animal up and looking for clues.
Would you call it country?
Well, it was on country radio. It wasn't on rock radio. So I would call it definitely wasn't country. It wasn't Barbara Mandrell country. It wasn't Hank Sr. country. It wasn't Maybelle Carter country. It was the country of the moment. It was new. I mean, every producer in town just had whiplash trying to figure out how to cut a record like Mutt Lange.
That is an awesome story. From what you're saying, let me see if I can synthesize this correctly. Garth had the drive, the marketing, the giant personality that kind of changed. He wasn't just a guy standing up there with an acoustic guitar singing drinking songs.
No, he wasn't.
And then Mutt Lange contributed like the Brian Wilson orchestral part that everyone was chasing.
He changed it sonically. He changed the sonic landscape of what hits our ears.
As the 1990s passed and Nashville got slick, Detective Pridemore spent almost a decade working on other cases. By 2001, he had stopped working on active homicides altogether. Pridemore left the daily gumshoe grind and looked for something cooler to do. Literally cooler. Cold cases. The old murder squad detective was transferred to the cold case unit. One unsolved case nagged at him. He remembers his first day at his new job.
A detective's not worth a grain of salt if he don't try to solve his unsolved cases first.
It had been more than 5 years since he had heard about the drug informant in Georgia who had a connection to Tony D'Antonio. So he made a phone call to the GBI. Beth Watts appeared to be one of those dreamers. She told me she came to Nashville from Carthage, Tennessee, ready to become a country music star. She was blonde and had a nice smile. She called men Mr. Beth's cousin, a 16-year-old kid, had written several songs and kept them in his underwear drawer. One was called Love Enough for Two. When she was searching around for songs to bring to Nashville, that's the one she chose. Beth recorded herself singing it, and she sent the recording through snail mail to Nashville producer Robert Metzger. She had included her phone number, so each day she would check her answering machine to see if Mr. Metzger had called her back. And sure enough, one day, he did.
Mr. Metzger called me and said that he just loved my demo tape, Love Enough for Two, and he wanted to get together. So I was really excited, and we made a time. He had a little office down off of Music Row in a house. And he was real happy to see me, real friendly. And he just gushed over how wonderful, my demo tape was, and he thought he could really make me a star. And he really wanted to go into the studio, and he really thought he could do something for my career.
He had white hair and was a little pudgy. He had this big, confident, gregarious personality.
Kind of reminded you of Santa Claus. I mean, he had that Santa Claus personality that, he could convince you to buy snow cones in a blizzard.
She heard it was expensive to become a star, so Beth Watts had set aside $10,000 to spend on her first record. Metzger took that money and promised to get her on the music chart. He said he wanted to bring on another producer-promoter to help. He wanted her to meet Chuck Dixon. She agreed to everything. Beth Watts recorded 2 new songs with Metzger working the mixing board. One was called Hell Froze Over. Metzger told her to sing it like she'd been drinking. And the second, another one from her cousin's underwear drawer, was called Every Time I Look for Love, I Go Blind. Spoiler alert, that song would rise to number 3 on at least one independent music chart. At the end of a long day of recording, Metzger congratulated Beth and walked her to her car.
And then it got time to leave. And so, he walked me out and walked me down to my car and hugged me again and kissed me on the mouth, which was not pleasant.
Oh, boy.
He was a real kisser and hugger and that kind of thing.
I've listened to Beth Watts sing, and I know this is going to sound awful, but she was not, what's the word? Good. Here's the thing. Even though she now says she was tone deaf as a rock, the Murder on Music Row might never have seen justice without a singer named Beth Watts. What happened to her turned out to be a huge turning point for investigators. Beth Watts had a secret. Next time on Murder on Music Row.
I wasn't in any real danger. Nothing was going to happen to me at Robert Metzger's office.
Just kind of solidified our understanding of the slimy independent music business.
I think I did a good job. I think the book is factual. Is there more to the story? I'm sure there is. There are people that I wish I could have done follow-up interviews with.
I've been hearing that there were like these predatory promoters.
Oh, yes. That's always gone on, and it still does.
Murder on Music Row was reported, written, and narrated by me, Keith Sharon. The executive producers were Gannett's Vice President of Local News and Tennessean editor Michael Anastasi, and Tennessean News Director Ben Goad. The project editor was Dwayne Gang. The sound editor was Amanda Rossman. Our reporting on the legacy of the Murder on Music Row doesn't end with this podcast. If you've been duped by an unscrupulous promoter in Nashville, we want to hear your story. Please send an email to ksharon@tennessean.com. That's the letter K, SHARON @tennessean.com. Include some details of what happened to you and how you can be reached. Thanks for listening.